My uncle tried to disinherit me by scamming me with forged documents. I prepared in advance and, right in front of my relatives, staged an audit that exposed his deception. What happened next was a public embarrassment he will never forget. Hi, this is Arena of Revenge. Here you'll find exciting stories with gripping plots and vengeance. Follow us. When my grandfather fell ill, the house on the outskirts of Milwaukee became the center of our family, and I spent more time there than anyone else, because I understood that adults were accustomed to hospitals and work, while I was the one listening to stories about their youth and looking at old photographs, trying to piece together the puzzle of our family tree. The understanding that documents and signatures could be weapons more powerful than words and insults had not yet matured. My grandfather was a man of strict habits. A clock on his desk, neatly folded newspapers, notebooks filled with notes that seemed meaningless, until I noticed in one of them a mention of a plot of land outside the city and an old dacha where he liked to spend summers. He didn't often talk about legacy, but in those rare moments of revelation, I sensed how important it was to him to leave something for future generations, and I was perhaps one of those he trusted. When he passed away, the family meeting was a formal affair. Relatives arrived, embraced, and said the right things. Among these faces, my uncle stood out, a man with an impressive resume who always had a knack for persuading as if he alone held the truth. My uncle had a persuasive way of speaking and a persuasive smile, and that day, this persuasiveness was aimed at getting everyone to reach a decision quickly and calmly, without unnecessary questions. I was no expert in legal intricacies, but I saw a folder of documents appear toward the end of the conversation, and my uncle was the one who spoke first about how the property should be divided, reminding me that the estate had long been in need of some sorting, and that it makes sense to make a practical decision for the common good. I thought this was a reasonable approach until I began to notice the details. The name on the line about the dacha looked different from what I remembered from childhood stories, and several items seemed rigged to exclude what might have been counted as my share. It seemed partly like a legal setup, partly like a carefully crafted plan that would work best if no one delved too deeply into the paperwork. I began checking the documents. I went to the notary's office, rummaged through files, asked for copies, recounted lines, and the more I read, the clearer it became that someone was trying to redistribute shares not in the family's favor, but in favor of those close to the estate. At first, my suspicions seemed far-fetched. Emotions are always high at such moments, and it's easy to slip into paranoia if you scrutinize every line too closely. But there were facts that defied dispute. The date on one document matched the period when my grandfather was still at home, but by the time the change was made, he was already too weak to understand the intricacies of the paperwork. I remembered how my grandfather sometimes confused the dates, which led to confusion in his testimony, and this meant one thing: someone could take advantage of his position. I didn't want to start a family conflict out of emotion, so I decided to proceed quietly and methodically. Gather as much information as possible, verify dates, copies, and facts that couldn't be refuted with simple words. First, I turned to old bank statements and notary appointment sheets. Where there were gaps, I requested additional copies, spoke with secretaries, and clarified signatures. As documents emerged, my understanding of the scale of the matter grew. My uncle had skillfully initiated conversations about optimizing the inheritance, and many relatives, without delving into legal subtleties, agreed with him because they trusted his experience. I felt a strange combination of fatigue and anger. Fatigue from having to prove all this, and anger that the man who smiled in family photographs could so calmly manipulate the fates of others. Then I began seeking support from those least trusted by the bureaucratic brass. Distant relatives, those who lived in other states and came for the funeral, and an old neighbor of my grandfather's who had worked in the mayor's office many years ago and knew how to read the annotations on documents. I didn't tell them everything, but I mentioned the issues and asked them not to take anything at face value until I had full copies. It worked. Distrust of hasty decisions grew, and my uncle became increasingly irritated because his quiet plan wasn't going so smoothly. At the same time, I studied the legal framework and realized that in the United States, especially within our state, there are clear regulations for the execution of wills and property transfers. Notaries and witnesses play a central role, and if discrepancies in dates and signatures are found, then page after page of evidence can be constructed to demonstrate the invalidity of certain documents. This understanding gave me real ammunition, not emotional, but documentary. I didn't intend to start a scandal for the sake of emotion. I needed to gather the facts so that they would become the absolute truth. One of the key moments was that I discovered several copies with different seals, and some of the seals looked unusual. The stamp was too sharp, the notary number was wrong, the details were slightly different. I wasn't an expert in seal fingerprinting, but I'd researched the subject enough to understand that forgery was possible, and that traces of it could be traced through inquiries to notary registries. This took time. I called offices in neighboring counties, sent inquiries, waited for responses, and each confirmation brought me closer to the truth. At this point, I also realized that my uncle hadn't acted alone. Someone from within had helped him prepare the documents, and this person had access to notary materials. It was an unpleasant truth. Sometimes family ties don't prevent collusion, they merely disguise it better. But instead of running to a lawyer screaming, I decided to develop a strategy. My goal wasn't simply to challenge a single signature. That would have been noisy and temporary. I wanted to expose the entire family to the mechanics of deception in a way that would have made it impossible for anyone to safely turn a blind eye and return to their former state of trust. I began planning my steps cautiously, collecting official evidence in the form of register extracts, requesting copies of wills from notaries, preserving all of my grandfather's old letters and emails that could show how his will and estate had evolved. I also sought out those who could confirm my grandfather's physical condition at the times when the important signatures were allegedly made. Witnesses and testimony could prove crucial, since if it could be proven that my grandfather was incapable of consciously signing the documents during a certain period, the documents would automatically lose their validity. All of this required patience, but I found it. Sitting up late at night, I rummaged through old records, talked to people on the phone, visited various authorities, and with each step, it became clear that my uncle was trying to gain control over the majority of the inheritance. Thoughts of revenge began to form in my head, but this wasn't a desire to inflict pain for the sake of pain. It was a desire to restore justice and prevent someone from taking advantage of someone else's helplessness. I didn't want drama or public scandal, but I understood that sometimes the path to the truth must endure fire and be tested. My next task became clear: to orchestrate a moment when the entire family would see the evidence beyond any doubt, when papers would speak louder than verbal assurances, and when those who wanted to squeeze me out of the inheritance would be confronted with a fact that could not be ignored. This plan required time, patience, and precise coordination, and I began preparing it, disclosing the details to no one except those who could help bring the truth to light, because I knew that if my uncle learned of this move, he would simply change tactics and I would have to start all over again. I realized that my uncle had decided to speed up the process and formalize everything for himself as quickly as possible, because just a couple of weeks after the funeral, he began actively calling relatives, urging them to gather at my grandfather's house and finally seal the deal. Although no real discussion had taken place before, and all anyone had seen was the folder of papers he kept hidden as if it were the Holy Grail. I was perfectly aware that this folder contained not only the real documents, but also pages he'd smuggled past official channels, which was precisely why his haste seemed so suspicious. When he mentioned that, "We all need to be adults and settle this once and for all," I nodded and feigned indifference, though inside, I was already formulating my own plan. I knew that in the US, such matters are handled officially, through lawyers and notaries, but my uncle was trying to frame it as a family gathering, where his charisma and ability to appeal to pity could sway the majority to his side. This was his territory, his rules, but I decided to play his game, pretending to be naive and indifferent to the inheritance, so he wouldn't suspect a thing. In fact, I'd already made several inquiries to the notary offices where my grandfather had previously processed documents, and the initial responses confirmed my suspicions. The dates and signatures didn't match, and the seals looked different than they should have. I sat over these documents in the evenings, like a student before an exam, poring over the details and comparing every letter. Meanwhile, my uncle continued to pump the rest of the relatives with beautiful speeches, saying that nobody wants legal red tape, that it's easier to trust experience, and that he always cared about Grandpa more than anyone else. They listened and nodded, because they were tired of the whole affair and wanted to put the matter to rest. What was especially annoying was when he started making jokes at my expense, like, "Well, our youngest doesn't understand a thing about these papers anyway." And the others laughed, and I laughed along with them, even though I felt myself boiling inside. But I didn't show any emotion, because I understood that the only chance the plan had of working was surprise. I had to make him believe I was completely out of the picture, and even glad he'd taken full responsibility. When he saw my indifferent face, he relaxed and became self-assured. Meanwhile, I was finding more and more evidence. I made a spreadsheet on my laptop, noting every date, every stamp, and every discrepancy, and gradually this spreadsheet turned into a weapon. I needed to not just point out the mistakes, but build a complete puzzle that would be impossible to ignore even for the laziest cousins, who were used to sleeping in meetings. I understood that in American courts, only facts are valued, while in a family, it's the show that counts, and I needed to combine the two. At the same time, I noticed that my uncle was starting to get nervous. He was calling his lawyer more often than before, sometimes stepping out into the hallway to talk on the phone, and his voice was becoming harsher. I pretended not to notice, although I knew perfectly well that he felt someone might set him up, and perhaps he was also suspicious of me. But I didn't give him any reason. On the contrary, I sometimes deliberately played along, asking him for details with the utmost silliness, so that he would feel even smarter. At that point, I began to gather allies. I knew I couldn't handle it alone, so I carefully spoke with distant relatives who lived in other states and weren't as close to my uncle. I didn't reveal everything, but I said it was best to wait for the official copies before making any decisions. People are always afraid of being deceived, and these words gave some pause. They didn't openly side with me, but at least they stopped agreeing with my uncle so quickly. That was already a small victory. The more I thought about the upcoming meeting, the more I realized I didn't have much time left. He wanted to hold a final in the coming weeks, and I hadn't yet collected all the data. I began working myself to the bone. I'd do my own thing during the day, sit down to documents in the evening, and write new requests at night. Sometimes I felt like the hero of a cheap thriller, where the main villain is already celebrating victory, while you're still picking the keys to the safe containing the evidence. But this thought only fueled my anger. I understood that his downfall had to be loud and public. Simply proving he was wrong wasn't enough. I had to make sure all the relatives saw that he deliberately tried to deceive us. Only then would his influence crumble completely. I imagined him coming out to the family with a folder, confidently delivering his beautiful speeches, and me taking out my copies and laying them out right on the table, forcing everyone to see what he was hiding. This image warmed me every night. He considered me a child who didn't understand anything, and that would be his biggest mistake. I wasn't going to rush. I was going to wait until he trapped himself, and then strike so hard that not a trace of his self-confidence would remain. I received the copies my uncle had used, and when I first unfolded them on the table, a chill ran down my spine, because everything on the papers was too carefully arranged to appear honest. The signatures had the same slight crookedness, as if they had been copied from the same original. The seals seemed to have been printed, not stamped, by a master notary. The dates were arranged in such a way as to create an artificial time series, advantageous specifically to him. These details revealed the hand of someone who knew how to disguise deception under the guise of bureaucratic precision. My first instinct wasn't to throw a tantrum. In the American legal reality, hysteria is often outdone by facts. But to do what anyone who wants to win the long game does in real life, I took the papers to a trusted professional. A lawyer I knew, a top real estate attorney, glanced at them, twirled the pen in his fingers, and said they were amateur-level forgeries. But the main thing was not to rush into things left and right, because good forgeries can be thwarted by legal rigmarole. You need a system of evidence, a chronology, and witnesses. He sensed my anxiety, but he looked at things coolly. This instilled peace. After the meeting, I didn't make a particularly proud appearance before the family, because my uncle was a master at creating the appearance of control, and even the boldest attack in the family could result in accusations of destructiveness. I began acting like a spy, feigning indifference during the day, but at night, turning into a hard-working evidence collector. The notary registers in our state turned out to be not so impenetrable. With the right requests, you can obtain copies of protocols, registration logs, and lists of valid forms. I filed official inquiries, wrote down registration numbers, deciphered the codes in the seals, and compiled everything into a spreadsheet where each line was a small blade against my uncle. It was important that everything appear as if these weren't my own conjectures, but official data from government agencies and offices, because in family battles, the rational word of the registry undermines the emotional arguments of a charismatic thief. Next, I contacted a former employee of the notary's office, a man who had quit a couple of years ago and now lived in the West, but who had a wealth of details about working with forms and seals in his head. Over the phone, he confirmed that some types of forms had long been written off, and some hadn't been used at all in the years when my uncle's papers were supposedly certified. His voice was dry, and every word resounded like a stigma. These forms are no longer in circulation. Our office never issued such a stamp. We have form issuance logs, and these numbers aren't there. I recorded the conversation and made it part of the dossier. Then I found witnesses, people who had seen my grandfather on specific dates and could attest to his condition. In one case, it was a caregiver; in another, a neighbor who helped him with firewood. Their testimony was intended to link my grandfather's physical condition to his inability to clearly sign documents on critical dates. People often don't understand the importance of temporality. The date of a signature plus the actual condition of the person provides the court with a powerful marker of invalidity. I spent evenings carefully organizing everything. Screenshots of applications to notary registries, copies of responses, printouts of phone conversations with a former employee, written witness statements, and even photographs of the forms I suspected of forgery, with close-ups of the seals so that experts could see differences in texture and the arrangement of microelements. All of this was important because in the U.S., expert witnesses are listened to, and forensic document examinations have resolved many cases. By this point, my uncle had begun to behave strangely. He'd show up at family events less frequently, calling relatives individually more often, urging them to get it all sorted out quickly, and calling his lawyer. I knew he was growing panicked. He sensed I might have a plan, so he tried to seize the initiative. He began to fudge other details, sending letters urging me to just trust his experience, arranging coffee meetings with those likely to be inclined to a quick decision, and even trying to bribe one of his distant cousins with a trifle so he'd suddenly forget about the official discharge request. But his tactics weren't about truth, but pressure, and I understood that pressure was his weakness. People make mistakes under pressure. I cleverly played along. I acted indifferent, letting him think I was the younger one, not worth wasting time on. And this relaxed him, because he considered me uninteresting. Internally, I was laying a new layer of trap, planning a public moment when I would present the collected papers at a family gathering. But before setting up a tribunal, I needed to prepare people so they would accept the evidence without bias. So I began to blend in with those they trusted, heart-to-heart talks with an aunt from out of state, using empathy with older relatives, explaining that it was better to wait for official copies than to rush to stamp papers submitted by one person. These conversations were a subtle effort to create an atmosphere of common sense. I also began recording his calls and meetings, gathering information about his contacts in notary circles, trying to understand who could help him with the forms. The more I knew about his network of contacts, the easier it was to anticipate his next moves. Meanwhile, he became more aggressive. He heard that I'd requested copies, and for the first time he tried to play on my fears. He threatened that if I didn't calm down, he'd make the matter public and show everyone how ungrateful I am. It was a typical trick, turning the conversation into accusations and painting me as a disturber of the family peace. I didn't react to the provocation. I understood his accusations were a smokescreen, and a proper response would only have heightened the effect. Instead, the following week, I approached those I considered potential allies with printouts of the registry responses, notes, and a simple, human explanation of why it was worth waiting and seeing how the official checks were going. One cousin, who always rushed to resolve matters quickly, frowned at first, but after I showed him a diagram with dates and a brief explanation of the difference between a real seal and an imprinted seal, he said he wouldn't rush to sign. This was my small, triumphant confirmation. It wasn't just me who had been working, but the truth. I understood that preparing a major public search was a risk. My uncle could try to physically destroy the papers, convince people I had fabricated them, and create a tumultuous emotional storm. So, in parallel, I supplied copies to several trusted contacts, stored the originals in a lawyer's safe, and made digital backups in the cloud, password protected, so that no attack could erase the traces. All this preparation was like a chess game. Every move was planned several steps in advance. And when I looked at the stack of folders in the safe, the feeling was strange. These weren't just papers. They were a tool and a defense, and at the same time a sword, ready at the right moment to rip apart the fabric of deception my uncle had built around the family. The understanding grew within me that the end would be brutal, and I was prepared for the fact that the truth doesn't always bring joy. Sometimes it breaks people, but if it isn't given an outlet, the lie will remain on the throne. And I couldn't let that happen. That evening, when we gathered again at my grandfather's house, the atmosphere was like before a thunderstorm. Everyone sat tense. Every remark sounded like a stone thrown into the water, and my uncle played the confident master of the situation. He waved his arms, talked about some agreements with lawyers, and swore that my grandfather allegedly left him the right to dispose of most of the property, and the rest of the relatives should only respectfully accept his will. And although it sounded impudent and defiant, I noticed that some of those present began to exchange glances, as if agreeing, and this is exactly what I needed, because the more my uncle felt confident in his position, the more he opened up, lost caution, and I deliberately played along, pretending that I was unpleasant. But I was resigned, sometimes demonstratively sighed, sometimes looked away so that he would think that I was giving in, and he, of course, began to press even harder. Listing the names of people who would supposedly confirm his words, mentioned some old connections with city officials, pretended that he had everything under control. And the longer this went on, the more the idea became ingrained in the family's mind that perhaps he really did know something, and I was just trying to argue out of resentment. And that was exactly what I needed, for everyone to see him as the winner by the time the blow came. I deliberately left a few old folders in the walk-in closet, pretending to have accidentally forgotten them, and when the conversation turned to paperwork, my uncle offered to show me the originals he'd prepared and reached into his briefcase, pulling out documents folded into a neat leather folder. He even paused to get my attention, and at that moment I noticed his hands trembling, though his voice remained loud and brazen. He then began waving copies of the will and other papers with forged signatures, which I'd seen before and had already double-checked through a lawyer I knew. But he pretended he was seeing them all for the first time and allowed the other relatives to lean toward his version. He was enjoying the moment like an actor on stage, raising his voice every time someone asked questions, and I could see how he was getting further and further into a trap, too engrossed in his role. To make my point, I even contradicted myself a couple of times, saying that perhaps I was being too emotional and that my grandfather really did want to transfer the bulk of the property to my uncle, since he was the eldest son. It seemed so sincere that my aunt nodded, and my cousin even muttered, "Perhaps that's how it should be." My uncle, sensing this shift, chuckled and pressed even harder, offering to sign a preliminary property division agreement right then and there so as to save time. This was the moment I'd been patient for so long. I saw his greedy eyes, heard his pressure, and knew it was time to let him feel like he'd won definitively. I agreed to sign, but asked for a day to organize my documents and review them again. My uncle agreed, though he pretended it was unnecessary, and it was at that moment that he finally revealed himself as a gambler who thought the game was won. In fact, I had already prepared the groundwork for the notary and lawyers to be present at the next meeting, and I had arranged with a friend who worked in the city archives to have the documents my uncle was planning to present verified and registered as forgeries. But I had to wait until the decisive day, and to that end, I continued to feign doubt and internal struggle, telling my relatives that all this was hard to accept, but that I probably had to, and giving my uncle the opportunity to feel increasingly confident. I couldn't sleep for a long time that night, replaying in my head all the ways it could go wrong. I imagined that if someone in the family took his side definitively and I couldn't prove the truth, I'd have to go to court in a weaker position. But each time, I returned to the fact that I had all the evidence and the main thing was to endure the game. The next day, I deliberately met with my uncle alone to finally convince him that I was giving in. At this meeting, I pretended to be ready to sign anything just to end the conflict. He relaxed so much that he began telling me about his people, who supposedly helped him prepare the documents. He even boasted that it all cost him, not that much. It was then that I realized I had gathered enough to crush him at the right moment. I recorded the conversation on my phone, carefully leaving it on in my pocket, and my uncle didn't even notice. When the day of our next meeting arrived, he showed up confidently, carrying the same briefcase, and I was already waiting with the notary and 2 lawyers, whom I introduced as family friends, though in reality they were ready to officially intervene. As my uncle began reading his originals, I feigned nervousness but signaled the notary, who calmly asked my uncle to show me the documents closer. A tense silence fell, and my uncle handed over the folder with a grin, expecting everyone to side with him. Little did he know, however, that within minutes his world would crumble like a house of cards. When the day of the decisive meeting arrived, the air in the house was so thick that it could be cut with a knife. All the relatives gathered around the long table in the living room. The old clock on the wall ticked too loudly, and even its sound seemed like a countdown to something big. My uncle walked in with such a self-confident gait, as if he had already arrived as a winner. His expensive suit shone. A smirk played on his face, and under his arm he carried that same leather briefcase. As if it were a symbol of his power, he barely nodded to the others and immediately headed to the center, throwing out a phrase that it was time to end this farce and secure everything in writing so that no one else would waste time and nerves. And I saw how some relatives nodded, as if agreeing, because they were tired of the tension and already wanted some kind of solution. And it was this fatigue that played into my uncle's hands. He was counting on it. He knew that people agree faster when they want to get rid of the conflict, and that's why his voice sounded especially confidently as he began laying out his papers on the table, like cards in a game he was already sure of winning. But he had no idea that this game had long since ceased to be his. I pretended to be nervous, as if I was about to lose it, tapping my fingers on the table, looking away, but occasionally glancing briefly at the notary and the lawyers, whom I introduced as family friends. No one paid attention to their neat folders and stern looks, because everyone was focused on my uncle, who was enjoying his show. He picked up one of the papers and read it aloud, feigning solemnity, and suddenly stopped, noticing that the notary was carefully studying the seal. He asked what was going on, to which the notary calmly asked to see the document closer, and at that moment the tension cut through the room like a bolt from the blue. My uncle tried to brush it off, saying it was a formality, that everything was fine with him, but the notary had already taken copies out of his folder and was comparing signatures, lines, stamps, and the longer he spoke, the colder his voice became. He explained that the seals did not match the official samples, that my grandfather's signature was different from those registered in the archive, and that the data in the document indicated a crude forgery. And at that moment the relatives began to make noise. Someone screamed, someone recoiled, and my uncle turned pale, but then pulled himself together and began to yell that it was a mistake, that the notary was bought, that I had set it all up. But I didn't let him develop an attack. I took out my phone and turned on the recording of our conversation, where he himself bragged that he found people who not so expensively forged documents, and his own voice echoed throughout the room, his every laugh. Every smug phrase sounded like a sentence, and even those who had still hesitated now looked at him with disgust. His face twisted. He lunged at the table, trying to snatch the phone, but the lawyer stepped between us. Then I made the final move, pulled papers from my folder and handed them to the notary. He read aloud that these documents contained an official statement about my uncle's investigation for fraud and that the materials had already been sent to court. This finished him off, and silence fell over the room, in which only his heavy breathing could be heard. My uncle tried to speak, but his words faltered. He no longer looked like a predator, more like a cornered animal. Every glance he gave his relatives was met with cold silence and disgust. Even those who had been ready to believe him only yesterday now turned away, and he realized he was alone. The lawyer calmly added that such actions were punishable by criminal prosecution and that a trial was inevitable. Uncle, losing his temper, threw the papers on the floor and stormed out of the room. No one followed him. Everyone watched him leave in silence, and for the first time, I felt like revenge had been achieved. My endurance, my doubts, my sleepless nights, it had all been worth it. I watched his world crumble before my eyes, and the feeling didn't feel like joy. It was a difficult but just end to a story where they were trying to erase me. Relatives surrounded me, some apologizing, others saying they'd underestimated me, but I didn't care. I looked at the empty chair where Uncle had sat and understood that now he could never again play the master of the situation, because everyone had seen his true face, and it was ugly. Later, I learned that the trial was indeed swift. The papers and audio recording became key evidence, and my uncle was convicted of fraud. His name became a disgrace. I hadn't simply defended my right to the inheritance. I had ensured that the truth became clear, and everyone understood who the real traitor was. But what I remember most wasn't the judge's words or the legal provisions, but the moment when, in front of everyone in my grandfather's house, my uncle's smug smile vanished and never returned. It was then that I realized that true revenge isn't shouting or fighting, but a cold, precise revelation that deprives a person of what they cherished most: respect and power.